There are no records left of the night the fire first burned through the rafters. Only the wind kept its testimony, carrying the smell of pine pitch and blood down the river bend. And even now, when the fields bloom again each spring, the earth swells as if remembering something buried beneath it. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The place was called Briar Hollow, though no briars grow there now. In 1834 it was the seat of Lord Silas Harrow, a man whose wealth was measured not in acres but in names, each name entered in his ledgers with the same careful script he used for livestock. The Harrow estate stood 12 miles from the James, its house of whitewashed brick built upon a foundation of red clay that never dried. Visitors said the walls sweated in the summer heat, and that the smell of iron rose from the ground after every rain. The earliest surviving document comes from a county inventory of 1834, listing among the property one giant mulatta female, unnamed, age indeterminate, height 6 feet and some inches, exhibiting signs of unusual strength. In Harrow's personal journal she appears as subject M. No birth name, no origin, only the note acquired in exchange for 2 field hands and 1 barrel of molasses, from a trader en route from the Carolinas. In later records she would be called Marianne, not by her master but by the house servants, who whispered of her size, her silence, and the unearthly calm with which she bore her burdens. Some said she had once spoken before her tongue was cut by a previous owner. Others insisted she chose silence as her weapon. All agreed she never raised her voice, not even when Lord Harrow began sending for her after nightfall. The house nurse Tess Adwell described her in an 1856 deposition as a woman of such bearing that one forgot her bondage for a moment. When she stood in a doorway she filled it. When she looked upon a man it was as though she measured his soul. No one recorded what Harrow saw when he looked back. The Harrow plantation kept meticulous records of crops, births, punishments. These were discovered decades later in a crate marked H. Misk 1830-47 in the attic of the county courthouse, sealed behind a wall of plastic. Most pages concerned tobacco yields, equipment orders, and the ordinary cruelties of plantation management. But in the margins of one volume, between entries on the purchase of hemp rope and a new field cart, there appears a notation in different handwriting. M. Delivered of child, female, March 3, strong, eyes gray. That single line begins a sequence repeated 9 times across 12 years, always the same format, always ending with a note of health and color. The last entry, dated August 1846, reads, M. Delivered of child, female, survived, marked resemblance to Sarah. By then, Marianne's body had given him 9 daughters. Briar Hollow's neighbors whispered about the Harrows long before any scandal reached official ears. Visitors found the daughters unsettling, tall beyond their years, pale-eyed like their father, silent like their mother. They moved together, never apart, speaking in gestures. When the younger children from the fields tried to play with them, they only watched from a distance, like creatures studying their reflections. In the winter of 1844, a traveling physician named Alton Greaves came to Briar Hollow, under the pretext of treating a fever epidemic among the enslaved. His surviving notes, preserved in the archives of the Richmond Medical College, make passing mention of Harrow's experiment in generational improvement. He described it in clinical tones. The proprietor pursues selective breeding between himself and his bonded stock with the stated aim of producing superior hybrid offspring. His words, not mine. The results are disturbing in their uniformity. Dr. Greaves did not stay the of Marianne's own voice. History retains nothing but rumor. The housemaid Dinah Clark, interviewed in 1891 by a northern journalist, recalled her as a woman who listened more than she lived. Dinah said that when the master came to her cabin, she would stare through him like a window he couldn't close, and after he left she would take a coal from the dying fire and scratch on the wall marks in rows and columns, like a child's arithmetic, though none could read what they meant. When the walls were torn down after emancipation, those marks were still visible beneath the soot. 9 columns, faint, but deliberate. The first signs of strangeness began in October 8. Harrow's overseer, Jonas Pike, noted missing tools, broken chains, and unexplained disturbances. In the quarters, livestock were found dead, their bodies arranged in patterns. The overseer blamed sorcery among the women, and requested permission to administer punishment. Harrow refused, perhaps out of pride, perhaps because he knew the truth of what he had done. By December, Pike had resigned without explanation. His replacement, Edric Vale, a younger man with no family ties, wrote frequently to Harrow's cousin in Petersburg, describing a peculiar unease in the hollow. In a letter dated January 3, 1847, Vale writes, The Negro cabins hum at night like a nest of bees. I cannot tell if it is song or murmuring, but it ceases the moment I draw near. The tall woman never sleeps, or if she does, her eyes remain open. That winter was the coldest in years. Ice sheathed the trees and the ground froze hard as stone. Yet the ledger from that season shows no drop in output. Harrow drove his people harder, fearful of debt, obsessed with completing his so-called presentation. In his mind, Briar Hollow would prove the success of his theories, his daughter's living evidence that blood could be improved through controlled crossing, his own private genesis. He planned a gathering for April to unveil his findings to the local gentry. None of them would see. Marianne's silence, which had once been taken for submission, had become something else, a kind of waiting. The nurse Tess noticed it first, writing in her later recollection. She looked at me once as I was binding her wrists for the birth. Her eyes said more than any sermon. I thought then she was measuring how long a human neck could bear pressure before it broke. The old cook Nella swore that Marianne no longer cast a shadow by firelight. The children whispered that she spoke to the river when no one was watching. One of them claimed to have seen her pressing her ear to the ground as if listening for something deep beneath it. No one questioned her openly. Fear like mildew had settled into every beam of the house. The last surviving entry in Harrow's own hand before the events of that April reads, Subject M exhibits increased resistance and insolence. Prescribe isolation until further notice. 3 days later, the plantation's blacksmith reported the iron collar from her neck missing. He swore he had not removed it. When Harrow demanded an explanation, the man fled into the woods and was never seen again. From that point, the surviving documents fragment, receipts half-scorched, reports unsigned, journal pages torn, but one item remains intact, a folded note found among Harrow's effects after his death in Richmond 5 years later. It is unsigned, written in charcoal on coarse linen. Tell him nothing. Tell him I am sick, and you gave me medicine. Tell him I am weak. The handwriting, archivists agree, was not Harrow's. There is a tendency among modern historians to doubt the supernatural. They will say that Briar Hollow's later hauntings, the voices, the figures seen in the fields, the 9 marks carved in barn doors, are merely legends. But legends are how the unspeakable survives when the written word fails, and sometimes when the wind shifts across that overgrown field. The reeds part as though something unseen is still walking there, something tall, deliberate, and waiting. The walls remember hands even when names are forgotten. Charcoal sleeps in their cracks like veins waiting for blood, and when rain soaks the clay, the marks rise again, black and glistening. After the disappearance of the iron collar, the estate changed temp. The house servants said it began with the dogs, how they refused to go near the women's cabins, how they paced the yard with hackles lifted at shadows. The overseer Vale logged the behavior as distemper and ordered the animals shot. Within a week 3 more dogs turned feral. When Vale cornered one behind the smokehouse, it lunged not at him, but at the empty doorway of Marianne's cabin. The diary of Dinah Clark, the seamstress, describes the same night. We heard the chain fall like thunder made of iron, then quiet. I prayed out loud, though I knew it made no difference. The cabin itself still stands in pieces in the county storehouse, oak beams warped but preserved. When restoration workers pried apart the planks in 1992, they found faint columns of tally marks burned into the inner wall. Each column had a name above it, written in a childish scrawl: Letty, Ruth, Honor, May, Clara, Eve, Dinah, Lila, and Grace. 9. Archaeologists speculated they were growth records, or crude calendars, but if you trace the rows carefully, you see rhythm patterns of 7s and 12s, not of years but of months, as though someone had tracked cycles of the moon, or of the body. In February 1847, a housemaid named Patience Field was sent with broth to the cabin. She returned white-faced and trembling. Harrow asked her what she had seen. Nothing, sir. She sleeps. That was a lie. Later in life, Patience confessed to the parish clerk's wife that she had found Marianne sitting upright, hands folded, eyes open. The collar lay bent beside her, the metal edges warped as though twisted by impossible force. On the dirt floor beside the bed lay scraps of hemp cord, half braided into something that looked like rope yet shaped more like a snare. And on the far wall, the one facing the woods, Marianne had begun loosening the boards with the handle of a spoon. Lord Harrow's journal grows erratic that month. Entries leap from agricultural tallies to frantic meditations on control. Discipline is the measure of civilization. They cannot love. They must be arranged. Mare refuses rations, starves herself to gain sympathy. Observe but do not indulge. He was preparing for his April presentation. drafting notes on heredity and moral refinement. He planned to exhibit his daughters as living proof of managed progress. They would serve the guests, recite passages from the catechism, and smile upon command. He even commissioned matching linen gowns from Dinah. She sewed them with shaking hands. The girls understood enough to be afraid. That winter, Tess Adwell, the nurse, tended to the youngest child, Grace, who had fallen ill with lung fever. Tess later wrote in a private letter, never sent, that Marianne stood outside the cabin door each night, not entering, only listening to her daughter's ragged breath. When Tess offered to bring her inside, Marianne simply placed her hand on the doorpost and shook her head. She was waiting for something, Tess recalled, not for the child to live or die, but for the right hour to move. By March, Grace had recovered. Tess never saw Marianne again by daylight. Vale's overseer reports, preserved in the Harrow archive until its seizure in 1865, provide the last mundane perspective before the chaos. March 12, chains discovered missing from storage, possible theft. March 14, subject M refuses food. Quarters, silent. March 15, patients reports fever, requests isolation of cabin. That final entry was filed in red ink, then crossed out. Beneath it, scrawled by another hand, perhaps Harrow's, were the words, "Do not disturb." Meanwhile, the rest of the plantation prepared for spectacle. Wagons arrived bearing casks of brandy, crates of porcelain, and barrels of salt pork. Harrow ordered the windows of the great house polished until they glowed. The invitation list included 20 planters and their wives, men whose fortunes depended on Harrow's approval, women who would gossip about the Harrow daughters and their strange beauty. In the evenings leading up to the event, the girls rehearsed under lamplight. Harrow made them walk in circles, balancing books upon their heads, reciting lines about gratitude and obedience. Dinah said their faces looked carved from wax. Marianne, confined to her cabin, was not mentioned, but silence is not absent. In the stillness before dawn, servants claimed to hear her counting, not words, just breath and rhythm. 1, 2, 3, sometimes reaching 9 before starting again. Others said they heard a different sound, like metal grinding against wood, slow and deliberate. On the morning of March 27, Vale visited the quarters and found the cabin door ajar. Inside, the chain was stretched across the floor in a neat spiral. The hearth was cold, untouched for days, yet on the wall above the bed someone had drawn a wide circle in soot with 9 small dots within it. Vale sealed the cabin and told no one. That night he resigned his position by leaving his badge and keys on Harrow's desk. The following day, a field boy found his horse wandering near the river. Vale was never seen again. The accounts of what followed diverged depending on who tells. The white guests later claimed nothing seemed amiss until the evening of April 3rd, when the lamps flickered during dinner. The black servants spoke of unease long before that, of whispers in the chimneys, of footsteps on the roof, of the air itself growing heavy. Patience Field, years later, said that the night before the party, Marianne appeared outside her quarters, face slick with sweat, eyes reflecting the moonlight. She handed Patience a folded scrap of paper and mouthed the words without sound, "Tell him nothing." Then she vanished into the dark. What remains certain is that Harrow ignored every warning. On April 3rd, as carriages rolled up the lane, he strutted down the steps in full waistcoat and gloves. His guests toasted his progressive theory. The daughters stood behind him in white linen, motionless, each with a thin ribbon of red thread around her wrist, the only color allowed. Inside the cabin at the edge of the wood, the boards finally gave way. She had been working them for weeks, splinter by splinter, until the last plank hung loose. Beyond it waited the fields and the low whistle of wind through pine. Marianne wrapped the broken chain around her arms, each loop tightening like armor, and looked once toward the main house where lanterns glowed against the sky. 9 breaths. She stepped into the night. Later, Folklore claims, the dogs began to howl exactly as Harrow raised his glass to make a toast. But that moment belongs to another part of this tale. What matters here is the preparation, the slow and terrible intelligence behind it, the way silence ripened into movement. The following morning, the kitchen was found empty, the hearths cold and the servants gone to ground. Harrow shouted for Vale before remembering he had none. When he finally thought to check the giant's cabin, he found only the chain curled neatly in the center of the floor like a shed skin, and the words, scrawled in ash above it, 9 free, before morning. Historians often debate the authenticity of that phrase. Some say the marks were added decades later by looters or by freedmen seeking closure, but the handwriting on that wall matched the crude script beside the 9 columns. The same strokes, the same pressure. Whoever wrote it understood counting better than language. And when the storm rolled in from the river that night,
Lightning struck the old sycamore beside the cabin, splitting it clean to the root. The flash illuminated the fields long enough for someone, maybe Patience, maybe Tess, to glimpse a single towering figure, walking toward the tree line, her silhouette framed by firelight, moving with the certainty of one who has already measured every step.
By the middle of March, the air on the estate had turned thick and strange, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. The dogs that slept beneath the veranda began to howl at night for no reason anyone could name. Lanterns would flicker when no wind stirred, and the sound of slow dripping like water seeping through wood could be heard in the main corridor long after the rain had stopped. Crowther ignored these things. He said such talk was superstition, that what people called hauntings were nothing more than poor nerves and idleness. But the servants whispered otherwise. They said something was stirring beneath the ground, something that did not rest easily. Yancey tried to keep order, but even he could feel the shift. The men worked slower, glancing toward the tree line as though expecting someone to step from it. The women refused to linger alone in the fields after dusk. One of the younger boys claimed he saw a tall woman standing in the river shallows one morning before sunrise, her dress floating around her like smoke. When he called out, the figure turned her head but had no face. Yancey struck the boy for lying, but later when he crossed the same bend of river he found 9 small stones placed in a perfect row along the bank. He kicked them into the water, yet that night he dreamed of them again, each stone glowing faintly in the dark. Crowther's obsession grew with every passing day. He had ordered new chairs brought into the dining room, an imported chandelier, and barrels of Madeira wine to impress his guests. He spent long hours locked in his study, writing letters no one was permitted to see. When he emerged, his hands were stained with ink, and his eyes held the feverish gleam of a man who believed himself on the brink of immortality. To those few who still spoke freely with him, he muttered about legacy, purity, and destiny. He claimed that nature itself was a ladder, and that men like him were meant to climb higher than others dared. Patience avoided him whenever she could. The moment she crossed the threshold of the main house, her chest grew tight, as though the walls themselves were pressing inward. She could not say why, but lately she heard breathing in places where no one stood. Sometimes as she prepared Crowther's tinctures, she felt a warm breath on the back of her neck. Though the room was empty, she had begun to think of leaving Greenbryer altogether, yet something held her there, fear perhaps, or the sense that the story was not yet finished. Late one evening, while cleaning the back corridor, she found a scrap of parchment caught between the floorboards. It appeared to be part of one of Crowther's letters, the ink smudged but legible. It read, "Of the 9 subjects, only the eldest retain the proper composure. The others exhibit nervous symptoms, refusal to speak, aversion to lamplight, irregular sleep. I suspect contamination, perhaps inherited from the mother. Isolation has proven effective in curbing these traits." Patience folded the paper and hid it in her apron. She did not know what it meant, but she knew better than to show anyone. Yancey saw less of Crowther in those weeks. The master spent most of his time inside the locked south wing, a part of the house no servant was permitted to enter. At night, light spilled from the cracks beneath its doors, flickering like a pulse. Yancey once pressed his ear to the wood, and thought he heard humming, a low, rhythmic tone that seemed almost mechanical, almost human. When he mentioned it to Crowther the next day, the man's expression darkened. "Curiosity," he said quietly, "has never served you well, Ed." After that, Yancey kept his distance. Outside, the spring storms grew more violent. Wind rattled the shutters and tore branches from the magnolias. Once lightning struck the field fence and set it ablaze. The flames died quickly in the rain, but in the morning, the scorched earth revealed something beneath it. Bones, small and pale, not animal. Crowther ordered the area covered before anyone could speak of it. 2 days later, one of the field hands went missing. He had been seen heading toward the river at dusk, but did not return. They found his tools by the bank, but no sign of him. That night, the dogs began to bark again, facing the direction of the water. Yancey tried to quiet them, but they refused to move, their eyes fixed on the dog. Crowther grew more irritable with each passing night. He accused the servants of neglect, of conspiring to embarrass him before his guests arrived. He forbade anyone from mentioning the disappearances. The mind, he told them, is the weakest link in any chain. Once it begins to imagine, it creates its own ghosts. But imagination could not explain what Yancey saw next. He had been checking the outer barns when he noticed light flickering from Sarah's abandoned cabin. For months the place had been empty, its door sealed, its walls blackened by damp. Yet as he approached, he heard movement inside. He called out but received no answer. Pushing open the door, he found the cabin as he remembered it, except for the marks. Along the far wall someone had scratched 9 vertical lines, each perfectly even. Beneath them, a 10th line had been started but left unfinished, as though the hand that made it had been interrupted. The air inside was colder than the night outside, and the faint scent of iron lingered in the air. He closed the door and walked away without looking back. The following morning, Patience noticed that Crotha's study door was ajar, something that had not happened in months. When she stepped inside, she found his papers scattered across the desk. There were diagrams, sketches of bodies, charts of lineage, and notations written in a hand more frantic than usual. Among them was a small glass vial filled with cloudy water, and something else floating within it, something like ash or hair. At the bottom of one page, Crotha had written, "Control the seed, and one controls the soul." She replaced the papers exactly as she had found them. By April 2nd, the atmosphere on the plantation had become unbearable. No one slept well. The house creaked and groaned as though settling under invisible weight. The candles burned shorter than they should have, guttering out before their time, and yet Crotha seemed calm, almost joyous. He spoke often of unveiling his findings to his guests, of showing them what he called the true refinement of human nature. Patience could not eat. The servants whispered that Sarah's name had been heard in the hallways, spoken in a voice not quite human. One claimed she saw a tall woman at the end of the corridor, half in shadow, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like glass. Another said that when she entered the pantry one morning, she found 9 chairs pulled out from the long table, as though someone had just finished a meal. Yancey began drinking from dawn till dusk. He told Patience he meant to leave after the gathering, that he could no longer bear the silence. "Something's coming," he said, his eyes bloodshot. "I can feel it in my bones. The land knows before we do." She did not answer. On the evening of April 3rd, a stillness fell over Greenbryer. The workers had gone to their quarters and the main house glowed like a lantern in the distance. Crotha stood on the veranda, watching the last light fade from the sky. For a moment, he thought he saw movement near the edge of the trees, a faint outline impossibly tall framed by the sinking sun. He blinked, and it was gone. That night the house grew unbearably quiet. The wind ceased. Even the insects seemed to stop their endless chorus. Somewhere deep within the south wing, a single door closed softly, though no one was near it. Yancey sat awake in his quarters, listening, waiting. He could not say what for, only that whatever it was had already begun. And far beyond the fields, near the bend of the river where the water ran slow and deep, 9 small piles of stone waited under the moonlight, each one newly made. By the morning of April 4, 1847, Greenbryer seemed unnaturally still. The air had the muffled weight that falls before a storm, when the sky is too bright and every sound seems sharpened at the edges. The magnolias stood heavy with new blooms, their scent thick enough to make one dizzy. From the kitchen yard to the distant pastures, there was a silence that felt almost deliberate, as if the earth itself had chosen to wait. Crotha rose early that morning, full of the self-importance that had lately sustained him. He ordered fresh linens in the guest rooms, and had Patience polish the glass in the dining room, until she could see her face reflected tenfold in the decanters. He spoke often of posterity, of the need to leave behind a record that would outlive him. He even laughed when Yancey tried to warn him about the unease spreading through the quarters. "You can't frighten a man with shadows," Crotha said. "I built this house with my own hands. There is nothing in it I do not own." But the walls disagreed. The servants had begun hearing whispers behind them as they worked, voices too low to distinguish, yet impossible to ignore. Doors they had latched would be found open. Candles would snuff out mid-prayer. In the east hallway, where portraits of the family hung in a solemn row, one painting, the likeness of Crotha's late wife, had tilted itself slightly overnight, though no one admitted to touching it. Patience tried not to see these things. She kept her head bowed, her work steady, her breath even. But that morning, when she passed through the west corridor, she stopped short. On the plaster wall, half hidden behind a hanging tapestry, were faint marks, 9 vertical strokes etched deep into the whitewash. Each was straight, deliberate, carved by something harder than a knife. Beneath them was a 10th line, barely begun. The surface of the plaster flaked around it like a wound. Patience stood staring, until Crotha's voice called from the next room, breaking her trance. She lowered the tapestry back into place and did not speak of it. At noon, clouds began to gather from the west, bruised and heavy. The guests were expected by evening. Yancey oversaw the last of the preparations with the numb efficiency of a man half convinced he was preparing for a funeral, rather than a party. Every noise startled him. When a servant dropped a tray, he nearly drew his pistol. The smell of the storm came closer, ozone and wet earth, and with it a strange coppery tang, as though rainwater were mixing with blood. Just before dusk,
A mule broke its tether near the barn and bolted toward the field. Yancey followed, shouting, but stopped when he reached the edge of the tobacco rows. There in the mud were footprints, bare, long, unmistakably human, leading from the direction of the river toward the house. They were fresh. He called out, but the wind swallowed his voice. The footprints ended abruptly in the middle of the field, as though the walker had vanished into the air. When he returned to the house, the first carriages had begun to arrive. The guests, planters and their wives, most of them old acquaintances, descended in fine clothes and false laughter. They admired the veranda, the polished wood, the spread of candles across the table. Crother received them with forced warmth, his charm practiced but hollow. He raised his glass and promised an evening of enlightenment. Tonight, he said, you shall see the future made flesh. No one knew what he meant. As the dinner progressed, thunder began rolling in the distance. The windows trembled in their frames. Patience and the others moved silently through the room, serving courses and refilling glass. But beneath the polite conversation, there was a disquiet no one could quite name. The guests avoided looking directly into the dark corners of the room. The air had grown cold enough that the women drew their shawls tight, though no draught stirred. Then the candles along the long dining table began to flicker. First one, then another, until the entire room seemed to breathe with them, light and shadow rising and falling in rhythm like a pulse. Crother laughed nervously. Just the storm, he said, but his voice betrayed strain. From the back of the hall came a sound like wood shifting under great weight. Yancey froze where he stood. The sound came again, lower this time, a groaning from the foundation of the house itself. Someone murmured that perhaps they should postpone the demonstration until morning. Crother snapped that the evening would proceed as planned. Patience, moving quietly near the pantry door, felt something brush past her, a current of cold air that carried with it the faint smell of river water. The sensation raised the hair on her arm. She turned toward the corridor, and saw that the door to the south wing, which had been locked for months, now stood open. Beyond it, only darkness. The storm broke suddenly, rain lashing the windows. The guests startled as a sharp crack of thunder shook the room. A few of the women rose, murmuring about the journey home, but Crother would not have it. Sit, he commanded. You will not want to miss what comes next. He crossed to the doorway of the south wing. Patience could not see what lay beyond him, but she heard him speak in a low voice, as if addressing someone unseen. Come, he said, it is time. The silence that followed was so deep it seemed to swallow the sound of the storm. Then faintly, from the darkness came the sound of dripping water. One of the guests gasped. The smell of damp earth filled the air. Yancey moved forward, half against his will. Sir, he said quietly, there's no one there. Crother did not turn. His body was rigid, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to something only he could hear. Then slowly, he stepped back into the light. His face had gone pale, his hands trembled at his sides. She's here, he whispered. At that moment, every candle in the room went out. The guests screamed as the darkness folded over them. Chairs scraped, glass shattered, lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating for a heartbeat the long table, the terrified faces, and at the far end of the hall the open doorway where water now pooled across the floorboard. When the lights returned, the doorway was empty again. Crother stood staring into it, his mouth open, his mind struggling to reconcile what his eyes denied. Did you see her? He asked no one in particular. Did you? But no one answered. The storm drowned every sound. In the confusion, Patience felt the floor tremble beneath her feet. Somewhere deep within the house, another door slammed, then another. The house seemed to exhale, releasing years of trapped breath. From the walls came the unmistakable sound of scratching, long, deliberate, and rhythmic. 9 strokes, then silence. When the guests finally fled into the storm, abandoning their carriages in the mud, Crother stood motionless in the dining room, soaked with rain that had begun leaking through the roof, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. Yancey tried to pull him away, but the man would not move. She's not gone, Crother said. She never left. Outside the wind howled through the magnolias. The lamps along the drive flickered out one by one until the entire estate lay in darkness. Only the river kept its voice, low and steady, carrying through the fields. By dawn, the storm had passed. The guests had scattered, the carriages abandoned where they sank into the soft earth. The house was in disarray, doors open, dishes broken, the floorboards damp and cold. Crother was found still seated at the head of the table, staring toward the empty doorway of the south wing. Yancey entered quietly, his boots echoing in the ruined silence. Sir, he said, it's over. Crother did not answer. He looked down at his hand. The skin beneath his fingernails was blackened, as though he had been clawing at something buried deep. On the table before him lay 9 smooth river stones. each one placed carefully in a line. Outside, the first light of morning crept across the field. It glinted on wet leaves, on broken glass, on the narrow track of footprints leading from the house toward the river, and ending at the water's edge.
The investigation into what had happened at Greenbryer began with silence. For 3 days after the fire, no messenger left the estate. The smoke rose over the valley in a grey column visible from miles away, and neighbors, wary of Crother's reputation, hesitated to approach. When at last a passing trader reported the ruin to the county magistrate, a small delegation was sent, 2 constables, a doctor and a clerk. They rode through the early mist of a March morning and found the plantation eerily still. The main house was gone, reduced to a blackened skeleton of beams and stone. The cabins stood mostly untouched, their doors hanging open, the interiors stripped bare. There were no slaves to be found, no living souls at all. The doctor, a nervous man from Richmond named Hollis, described the scene in his report, the air still carrying the acrid tang of burnt wood and something else he did not name. In the cellar beneath the kitchen they found what remained of Nathaniel Crother, identifiable only by his signet ring. Beside him lay several lengths of broken chain. Hollis noted that the links appeared to have been twisted apart rather than cut, as though subjected to immense force. The constables searched for survivors until dusk. They found traces of movement in the woods, trampled earth, ashes from small fires, but no people. It was as if Greenbryer had simply exhaled its inhabitants into the trees. The clerk, a thin young man named Ellis, recorded everything with shaking hand. He wrote that at sunset, as they prepared to leave, they heard a woman's voice from somewhere deep in the ruins. It said only one word, mine, softly, almost like breath. When they searched again, there was nothing. The official inquiry concluded that the slaves had revolted, killed Crother and fled. It was a story that satisfied the authorities and allowed the county to move on. The estate was sold at auction, though no one who bought it ever stayed long. By 1852 the house had been abandoned entirely, the land left to return to forest. Years later, Hollis could not let the memory go. He began collecting fragments about the place, local rumors, letters, the faded ledger of one Edmund Yancey recovered from a family attic. Yancey's handwriting deteriorated toward the end, but his words were clear enough. He wrote of Sarah, the woman Crother had kept locked away, and of a silence that was not submission but waiting. He wrote that she asked him once how long until spring. Hollis read those entries until he knew them by heart, and sometimes when he dreamed, he saw her eyes looking through the cracked cabin door. In 1861, as the country itself began to burn, Hollis returned to Greenbryer. The house was little more than a moss-covered foundation. The cabins had collapsed under ivy and rot. He walked the property with his journal, noting the strange stillness, the way the birds refused to cross a certain line near the old well. There he found something impossible, marks carved into the stones, 9 columns, each topped by a small cross, and beneath them a 10th, unfinished. The carvings were fresh, not weathered by 15 years of rain. He copied the symbols carefully, though his hands shook. In his notes he wrote that when the wind passed through the hollow where the house once stood, it made a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. He returned to Richmond pale and ill, insisting he had inhaled some contagion from the ruins. His colleagues said it was pneumonia. Before he died, he told a nurse that the woman in the cabin was still there waiting for her daughters. The nurse assumed it was delirium, but she remembered how his voice changed, half awe, half dread. In the decades that followed, the story of Greenbryer passed into legend. Travelers on the western road spoke of hearing chains clink in the distance, or seeing a tall figure standing among the trees at dusk. Hunters claimed to find strange symmetrical footprints in the mud, too long for a man, too narrow for a bear. Some said the figure protected those who were lost, leading them out of the forest. Others swore it lured trespassers deeper in, never to return. In 1898, a historian named Margaret Ellison began researching plantation records for a book on antebellum industry. Among the papers of the Agricultural Society of Virginia, she discovered a presentation by Nathaniel Crother on selective breeding for labor improvement. The language was cold, technical, full of measurements and projections, but in the margins of the final page, someone had written a single word in another hand, monster. Ellison followed the trail to county archives and found Hollis's report. She traveled to Greenbryer herself in the spring of 18. In her journal, later published posthumously, Ellison described the ruins as curiously preserved. No undergrowth inside the perimeter where the main house had stood, as though the soil itself rejected new life. She stayed one night in a tent near the old foundation despite warnings from locals. At dawn she recorded hearing what she first thought was wind, then realized was the sound of weeping. When she turned toward the woods, She saw just for an instant a tall woman in a torn white dress, her hair gray as ash, her eyes burning like embers. Then the figure was gone. Ellison's final entry reads, "She does not haunt this place for vengeance. She waits because something of hers remains unfinished. The land remembers what men tried to erase." Her body was found 2 days later by a passing farmer, cause of death exposure. But those who handled her things claimed that the pages of her notebook were damp, not with rain but with salt water, as though it had been wept upon. In the years after Ellison's death, the Greenbryer site became a curiosity for spiritualists and scholars alike. Some came seeking proof of ghosts. Others came to test electromagnetic theories or psychological explanations for fear. None stayed long. Instruments malfunctioned. Compasses spun useless. More than one visitor reported dreams in which a voice whispered a litany of names: Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, Naomi, Hannah, Abigail, Miriam, over and over until they woke trembling. In 1932, a WPA survey team cleared brush from the area and discovered the remains of the cabins. Beneath the stones of the largest foundation they found an iron collar fused to its chain. The metal had warped as if melted by intense heat, but the surrounding stones were unscorched. The collar was sent to the Smithsonian for study, where it was promptly misplaced. A curator later admitted that several staff refused to handle it, saying it gave off a faint vibration when touched, like a heartbeat. Even now, locals claim the Greenbryer Hollow stays colder than the surrounding country. On still nights, travelers hear distant humming, a woman's voice, low and endless, reciting names carried on the wind. Some say she calls to her daughters, others that she counts the wrongs done there, and some, the oldest among the community who still keep the oral histories, say she is not angry anymore. They say she became something else, an old power that watches the valley, ensuring no master rises again in that place. The county long ago erased Greenbryer from its maps, though the forest still bears its shape if seen from above, a dark scar of trees forming 9 uneven lines and a 10th, broken one at the edge of a creek. When the sun sets behind that ridge, the air grows heavy and the world holds its breath. Then faintly the chains stir, not in threat but remembrance, and in that silence, if you listen long enough, you may hear the whisper that outlived every cruelty: "They are mine." By the time the 20th century turned its first half-century, Greenbryer had become less a place than a rumor. The land was swallowed by pine and laurel. The road that once led to the estate was repurposed for timber transport, then forgotten altogether. Only a few aging locals could point to the exact ridgeline and say quietly. In 1974, a graduate student named Thomas Keene from the University of Virginia began researching unexplained disappearances on former plantation sites. He was 26, earnest, and skeptical of anything that smelled of the supernatural. His interest in Greenbryer came from an obscure footnote in an anthropology paper, Margaret Ellison's last journal entry quoted in a regional folklore study. It fascinated him, that combination of documented fact and whispered myth. The archives were thin, a few letters from Hollis, fragments of Crother's agricultural paper, and an 1846 inventory that listed in chilling precision 9 unnamed female assets. Tall of stature, Keene decided to visit the site himself. He found the location by cross-referencing land records with old survey maps, driving hours through empty countryside until the pavement ended. He parked his car near a rusted gate and walked the last mile under a rising moon. The forest felt too quiet, as if sound itself had been muffled. His flashlight beam caught nothing but trees and fog, but the air carried a strange rhythm, almost a pulse, low and slow. He camped near what he believed was the old main house foundation. The night pressed close, the kind of dark that swallows the sky. Around midnight, his tape recorder clicked on by itself. The tape hissed, then filled with a faint humming, a woman's voice whispering names. He thought it was a radio signal, until he realized the words were repeating in the same order, soft but distinct: Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, Naomi, Hannah, Abigail, Miriam. He turned on the lantern, heart racing. The forest stood motionless, yet from the shadows beyond the ruined stones came a slow, rhythmic creak, like metal stretching. He forced himself to approach, expecting to find a fallen fence. Instead, he saw the iron collar fused to one of the old foundation stones, glinting faintly under the lantern light. He had read Hollis's report, knew the artifact should have been taken decades ago, but there it was. He reached toward it, and the ground trembled. Later, he could never describe exactly what happened. He remembered the air thickening,
the sound of chains cascading through the soil like roots being torn up, and the unmistakable scent of smoke and salt water. When he came to, dawn had already broke. His tape recorder lay beside him, battery drained. The collar was gone. In its place were 9 small depressions in the earth, arranged in a curve like the marks of kneeling figures. Keane left the forest and drove straight back to Charlottesville. He wrote his experience down as an episode of exhaustion-induced hallucination, but he kept the tape. When played back on university equipment, it carried 17 seconds of audio that technicians could not explain, a low hum rising into a single whispered word. He never returned to the site, though over the years his students noticed odd things about him. He avoided mirrors. He would sometimes stop mid-sentence in lectures on cultural memory, stare at the far wall and say, "History doesn't sleep." When he died in 1993, his papers were donated to the university archive. Among them was the tape stored in a plain envelope marked Greenbryer, not for playback after midnight. For years, the envelope gathered dust, until a young documentarian named Elise Warren found it while researching lost plantations of the American South. She was meticulous, rational, the kind of historian who believed every haunting could be traced to injustice and every ghost to guilt. The legend of Greenbryer intrigued her because it wasn't about a single murder or treasure, it was about silence itself. In early spring of 2005, Elise traveled to the site with a small film crew. They expected ruins. What they found instead was stillness so complete that even their drone's rotors sounded muffled. The crew set up near the foundation line, using ground-penetrating radar for a segment on unmarked history. The radar returned an impossible reading. Beneath the soil lay 9 vertical voids arranged in a half-circle, each roughly human-sized. That night, Elise reviewed the footage alone. The thermal camera, left running after the crew turned in, captured faint light patterns rising from those same 9 points, heat signatures without bodies. As the images flickered, a voice whispered faintly through the static, "Spring." Elise stopped the recording, heart pound. She stepped outside the tent, camera still rolling. The air smelled of rain and iron. Across the clearing she saw movement, a tall shape emerging from the fog, its hair white as frost, its outline both solid and shimmering. Elise didn't run. She lifted the camera. The figure looked at her, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that gaze, ancient, knowing, patient beyond all reason. Then it spoke, not aloud but inside her mind. "Remember them." When the rest of the crew woke at dawn, Elise was gone. Her camera sat on the ground, lens cracked but still recording. The final frame showed the clearing empty, except for a faint impression in the soil where she had stood, one more mark completing the circle. The footage became the subject of endless speculation online. Experts argued the anomalies were lens flares or sensor glitches. The university, anxious about its reputation, sealed Keane's and Warren's materials in a restricted archive. Yet locals swear that each spring, when the first thunderstorm rolls through the valley, a new wildflower blooms where the old cabins once stood. 9 at first, then 10. Now the forest has reclaimed everything. GPS signals falter near the ridge, and hikers who wander too far say the air grows heavy, the wind humming like a woman's voice reciting names. Sometimes, the rhythm changes, as if counting has given way to prayer. No one knows what happened to Elise, but every few years, a visitor to the archives reports a strange sound when handling her camera battery or the old tape from 1974, a faint heartbeat, and beneath it, a whisper that feels both warning and benediction. She remembered, and so Greenbryer remains, half history, half haunting, an open wound in the earth that refuses to close. Not vengeance, not curse, but memory, given form, a silence that outlasted generations, waiting not for justice, but for acknowledgement. If you ever find yourself driving through the western Virginia hills, and the air suddenly grows still, if the road bends and the forest seems to lean in close, you'll know you're near it. Don't stop. Don't look for the ruins. The land remembers enough for all of us, and somewhere in that endless quiet, a woman who was never allowed to speak still whispers through the roots and rain, "They are mine."
The file labeled Project Greenbryer 2006-2012 was not catalogued under history or anthropology. It was misfiled, perhaps deliberately, among medical case studies in the University of Virginia's restricted archives. Inside the folder were 17 typed pages, a few Polaroids, and a compact disc marked only GBE7. There was no author name, but the first line read, "Des. Field Report, Dr. Elias Brandt, Department of Cognitive Pathology, February." Brandt had been a neurologist turned folklorist, an odd combination that puzzled his colleagues until they realized his specialty was transmitted psychogenic phenomena, shared delusions that appeared to spread through families, villages, or as he once wrote, digital communities. When he came across the story of Greenbryer, he saw not a haunting but a perfect case study of generational contagion. He began by interviewing those who had handled the previous materials, keen students, the technician who digitized Elise Warren's tape, the curator who sealed the envelope marked "Not for playback after midnight." The first two were polite but evasive. The third refused entirely, claiming the recording caused auditory residues that mimicked memory. Brandt noted the phrase with academic detachment, writing that such complaints were consistent with post-suggestive hysteria. Then he made his first mistake. On March 12, 2007, he requested playback clearance for the GB tape. The technician hesitated, reminding him that the audio had corrupted several machines. Brandt laughed, said that Folklore often hid behind superstition, and pressed play. The transcript of that session exists in the file, for 17 seconds, static, then a low hum like breathing underwater. At 13 seconds the waveform spikes. Brandt wrote, "Perceived vocalization, female, low register, possible phrase mine or nine, heart rate elevated to 100, no external source identified." He ended the test, made notes on psychosomatic stress, and filed for a second session the next evening. 2 days later his assistant Helen Rowe reported that Brandt had not shown up for lecture. She found him in the lab, sitting upright, headphones still around his neck. The tape had stopped. His eyes were open, unfocused. He responded to her voice only by repeating the word "pat." Medical evaluation showed dehydration, mild hypoxia, and something stranger, small burns along both temples, circular, matching the shape of the headset pads. When asked what he remembered, he wrote a single line on the clipboard. She was counting. The university placed him on leave. Helen packed his things, and against protocol took copies of his notes. They formed the bulk of the surviving document. Her handwriting changes halfway through, tighter, more hurried. April 10, 2007. Dr. B refuses to rest. He insists there is an arithmetic hidden in the myth. 9 daughters, 9 marks, 9 returns. Says he can hear the intervals in the static, that the tape carries genealogical rhythm. When I asked what that meant, he said every silence carries a pulse if you listen long enough. A week later, Brandt disappeared from Charlottesville. He left a short letter on his desk, addressed to the department chair. "I will finish the study where it began. She wants completion, not cure." He drove south toward Powhatan County. His car was later found abandoned near the overgrown access road to the Greenbrier. For 6 years there was no official record. Then in 2013, a forester named Cole Ransom discovered a small corrugated metal structure, deep within the property, half collapsed under vines. Inside were notebooks sealed in wax and a rusted recorder. The notebooks were damp but legible. The first pages were diagrams, spirals, intervals, sets of 9 drawn again and again, then scattered through the margins. More words, resonance, memory, voice. Later entries read like confessions. "I tried to chart it matches cardiac rhythm at rest, yet accelerates when I write her name. It is as if the story itself requires pulse to continue. Each repetition tightens the pattern. Each telling births the next." He recorded himself on the machine, perhaps hoping to document changes in his cognition. The final track lasts just under 2 minutes. The first 30 seconds are spoken clearly. This is Dr. Elias Brandt, continuing my observations. The voice has shifted pitch lower now, nearer to breath than speech. It coincides with the movement of water in the soil after rain. I believe there is a click, a pause, and then faint laughter, distant, layered, a whisper, "Count with me," the sound of pen scratching, then nothing. Ransom turned the materials over to authority. The investigation concluded that Brandt likely died of exposure, or drowning in the nearby river. His body was never recovered. The notebooks were transferred once more to university custody, sealed under health safety restrictions, but the contagion of curiosity spread again. Students petitioned for access, convinced the so-called Greenbryer pattern represented a lost code, perhaps a musical notation hidden within the speech frequencies. In 2016, an unauthorized scan of one page leaked online. The image went viral among occult forums, where users began replicating the pattern as a sound wave overlay. Within weeks, threads filled with identical reports, faint whispers through speakers, sleep paralysis, the smell of wet soil. Most were hoaxes, some weren't so easy to dismiss. The university responded by removing all digital copies and issuing a formal denial of paranormal content. Yet the following semester, 3 members of the acoustic analysis lab withdrew from classes citing insomnia and persistent auditory counting. The surviving lab notes, later leaked anonymously, include this final line beneath a waveform: silence visible between beats, ratio not. As if waiting for the 10th, no one could determine what the 10th meant. Some suggested it referred to Elise Warren, the last known person to vanish at the site. Others believed Brandt himself was the 10th, completing the sequence. Today the file remains sealed, but researchers who have handled it describe an odd vibration through the paper, a faint rhythmic tremor that fades when the folder is closed. One archivist joked that it was only air conditioning. Another refused to enter the room again. What began as slavery's record of violation had turned into something stranger, an infection of remembrance, transmitted not through blood, but through attention. To study it was to join it. When the war finally reached Powhatan County, Greenbryer was already rotting from the inside. The once bright paint of the main house had peeled to gray, and the fields that once shimmered with tobacco and cotton now lay choked with weeds. Rumors spread through the soldiers who passed along the road that the plantation was cursed. They said no crops would take root there, that tools rusted overnight, and that sometimes at dusk, a woman's shadow crossed the fields, though no one lived there anymore. The war had stripped Crother of everything but his land and his madness. By the spring of 1863, even the enslaved families who had survived his reign were gone. Some escaped with Union troops, others scattered into the hills. Only the main house and Sarah's cabin remained. For years she had been nothing more than a rumor, a chained figure hidden behind boarded window. But now, as the world beyond Greenbryer burned, her silence began to hum like something alive. Edmund Yancey, old and unwell, was one of the few who stayed. He claimed he had nowhere else to go. His journal from that time would later be found buried beneath the floorboards of the overseer's quarters, pages yellowed and brittle but still legible. In it he wrote of strange sounds, low vibrations, like wind through iron, coming from Sarah's cabin even when the air outside was still. He wrote that the marks she carved into her wall had grown. What began as 9 columns had expanded, forming circles and patterns that no one could decipher. Crother, by then half mad from isolation and guilt he refused to name, took to pacing the halls at night. He muttered about destiny and bloodlines, about how his work would outlast the war, how his daughters, his creations, would carry his name forward. But there were no daughters left to carry anything. One by one they had vanished, sold, escaped, or simply disappeared into the silence of the swamp. One storm-heavy night in July, lightning struck the oak outside Sarah's cabin, splitting it clean down the center. Yancey wrote that he saw the flash from his window, followed by a sound that did not belong to this earth. The next morning, he went to check the cabin, and found the chain that had bound Sarah lying slack on the floor, the bolt torn from the wall as if by impossible strength. The door, though still locked, had been forced open from the inside. Sarah was gone. At first, Crother refused to believe it. He insisted she could not have escaped. He sent Yancey and 2 field hands to search the wood. They found no trace of her, only the impression of bare feet in the soft mud by the riverbank, and caught in a branch above the water, a single length of rusted iron, bent like a ribbon. That night, Crother barred the doors of the main house and ordered lamps in every room. He carried his pistol everywhere he went, sometimes whispering to it, as though it were an old friend, but the lights could not keep the darkness out. The servants who remained heard noises, footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, long after Crother had gone to bed. They said the footsteps were too heavy for a man, that the boards groaned the way they had when Sarah once walked across them years before. Yancey's journal described what happened 3 nights later. He wrote that Crother burst into his quarters just before dawn, pale as a corpse, claiming that Sarah was in his dreams. She stood at the foot of his bed, her eyes burning, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. He said she was counting names. 9, he whispered. She kept saying 9. By the end of that week, Crother locked himself inside his study, the same room where Sarah had once stood with the knife in her hand. He refused food and spoke to no one. The last entry in Yancey's journal says, "The house groans like a living I do not think the master sleeps. I hear whispering through the walls, though the words are too soft to catch. It sounds like water and wind and the voice of a woman who has waited too long." When Yancey finally gathered the courage to enter the study, he found Crother slumped over his desk, his face frozen in terror. Around him the walls were covered in the same markings Sarah had carved into her cabin. 9 columns, 9 circles, 9 lines crossing one another like a web.
No sign of Sarah was ever found. After the war, Greenbryer fell into ruin. Vines overtook the house and the roof collapsed in on itself. Locals avoided the place. Some claimed to see a tall woman wandering the fields at dusk, her gray hair loose, her eyes catching what little light remained. Others swore they heard her voice, soft and measured, whispering from the shadows, not words of sorrow but of judgment. In 1891, when a team of surveyors came to map the land, they found the remains of Sarah's cabin. Inside, beneath the cracked floorboards, they uncovered a series of carved symbols, spirals and lines arranged in deliberate order. No one could interpret them, but one of the surveyors, a young man named Joseph Clark, later wrote to a Richmond historian describing this. His letter ended with a single chilling line: "It is as though someone was keeping account of every cruelty ever done on that land." For nearly a century, the story of Sarah and her 9 daughters faded into local legend. The plantation's name changed, then vanished from records altogether. But in 1937, during a works progress administration project, an archivist cataloging old county documents found a stack of weathered church letters, among them Reverend Thomas Sheffield's account. It described the visit to Greenbryer in 1845, the strange number of mixed-race girls, the silent woman he was forbidden to see. Attached to the letter was a copy of a sermon draft he never delivered. In it he wrote, "Silence can be the loudest cry of all when spoken by those who have been denied the right to speak." That discovery reignited interest in the story. Historians debated whether Sarah was real or myth, a symbol of guilt and retribution in a haunted city. But those who visited the ruins of Greenbryer often returned with uneasy stories about the air growing heavy near the old cabin site, about the faint sound of chains dragging in the grass, about whispers that seemed to come from the ground itself. In the spring of 1952, a photographer named Ruth Collins traveled to the site to document what remained. She spent 3 days taking pictures of the overgrown foundations and the skeletal trees. On her last evening, as dusk fell, she developed one of her plates in a portable darkroom. In the faint outline of the photograph, capturing what should have been only the cabin's threshold, stood a shadow, tall and unmistakably human. She packed up her equipment that night and never returned. In her journal, later found among her papers, Collins wrote something that echoed Yancey's words a century earlier: "The silence here hums. It's not absence, it's presence. It's waiting." Today, Greenbryer is nothing more than an unmarked patch of forest. Travelers driving through Powhatan County pass it without notice, but locals still speak softly of the woman who never spoke in life and yet never stopped speaking after death. They say on certain nights when the air is still and the moon hangs low, you can hear her whisper from the tree. Some claim it's the wind, others insist it's the sound of chains breaking again and again forever. And if you listen long enough, they say you can hear her counting: 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9, each number a name, each name a memory, each memory a wound that refuses to fade. Sarah's story, carried in the earth itself, became Greenbrier's final inheritance, not the wealth or bloodline that Crother once dreamed of, but a reckoning that no time could erase. Her silence had been her weapon, her voice the storm that came after. And though the world forgot her for a century, the land remembered, because silence, when sharpened by suffering, never truly dies. It waits, it listens, and when the moment comes, it whispers back everything that was ever done in its presence.
By the early 2000s, Greenbryer had all but disappeared from the maps. The land had changed hands so many times that its history had become little more than a rumor told in half-whispered warnings. Locals said the soil there wouldn't grow corn or wheat, that machinery broke down whenever anyone tried to build, that the trees grew at odd angles, like they were leaning away from something beneath the earth. Most people dismissed it as folklore, another ghost story born from the South's long shadow. But then came the university team from Charlottesville. Dr. Emma Caldwell led the anthropology department's field study that summer, focused on forgotten plantations and unmarked burial grounds. Her specialty was reconstructing lost histories through soil analysis and oral accounts. When she first read about Greenbryer in an obscure 1930s WPA archive, she was struck by the repeated references to the silent woman. The report described her as a tall, enslaved female kept in isolation, connected to numerous unsolved disappearances. There were no records of her existence in census rolls or slave ledgers, only scattered mentions across journals and letters. To a historian, that kind of silence meant there was something deliberately buried. Emma and her small team arrived in Powhatan County in June. The road to the property had long been reclaimed by forest. They found the old gatepost lying in the weeds, the iron hinges rusted and overgrown. The main house had collapsed decades ago. All that remained were outlines of its foundation and a scattering of brick and bone-colored plaster. What drew their attention immediately, though, was the site where Sarah's cabin once stood. The trees there grew in a near-perfect circle, their trunks unusually pale, their bark smooth as if polished by weather or something else. The air felt different, thicker, quieter. One of the students, Marcus, said he could feel vibrations in the ground when he stood near the center of the clearing, like a faint pulse beneath the soil. At first they thought it was imagination, but then came the sound recording. Each night, the team left motion-triggered recorders running around the site, hoping to capture wildlife sounds for comparison. On the third morning, they reviewed the audio. Between 2:13 and 2:17 a.m., every device registered a low hum, rhythmic and steady like breath, and beneath it, barely audible, was something that made the entire group fall silent. A voice, soft, deliberate, whispering what sounded like numbers. 1, 2, 3. The file continued until 9. Then static. Marcus laughed nervously, assuming it was interference, maybe an animal sound distorted by wind. But Emma wasn't convinced. The cadence was too human, too deliberate. She ordered the team to map the entire site with ground-penetrating radar. 2 days later, the results came in. Beneath the soil, arranged in a precise arc near the center of the clearing, were 9 depressions, each identical in depth and length. Burials likely. The team requested a permit for limited excavation. It was granted within a week. They began digging carefully, layer by layer, documenting every find. What they uncovered were fragments, bone, pottery, rusted iron. But the bones didn't match what they expected. Each set appeared female, adolescent, tall for their estimated age. The measurements aligned eerily with 19th century reports of Sarah's daughters. And in the center of the circle, just beneath the surface, they found something that stopped them cold, an iron collar, snapped clean in half. Emma sat there for a long time staring at it. She later wrote in her field journal, "It's as if the ground is exhaling, like this collar was waiting for someone to see it." That night a storm rolled in from the east. The team sheltered in their vans, rain hammering the roof, thunder shaking the tree. Around midnight, Marcus swore he saw a figure standing by the clearing, tall, motionless, barely visible in the flashes of lightning. He called out, thinking it was one of the crew. But when he turned on his flashlight, there was no one there, only the iron collar glinting where they had left it, wet and shining like new. By morning, the collar was gone. Emma assumed it had been stolen or buried again by the rain, but the soil around the hole was undisturbed. What was disturbed were their instruments. Every camera battery had drained to zero. Every recording device displayed a corrupted file, except one. The single surviving file contained just 6 seconds of audio, a woman's breath, followed by 3 words. "They are mine." Emma recognized the phrase immediately. She had read it in an old transcription of Yancey's journal, the overseer's final entry before Greenbrier's fall. After that night, members of the team began to leave. Marcus quit first, refusing to return to the site. Another student developed severe insomnia, claiming she heard whispers outside her tent. Within a week, only Emma remained. She stayed one last evening, determined to finish documenting the dig. She wrote her notes by lantern light, her hands trembling slightly though the air was still. Around midnight she heard movement behind her. Not footsteps, exactly, more like the dragging of something heavy through the leaves. She turned. At the edge of the clearing stood the faint outline of a woman, tall, broad-shouldered, her face lost in shadow. The lantern flame flickered though there was no wind. The figure did not move closer, but the sound began again, soft, deliberate, counting. 1, 2, 3. Emma couldn't move. Her breath caught as the count reached 9, then silent. The figure slowly raised one arm and pointed toward the ground where the iron collar had been found. Emma's lantern went out. When she awoke at dawn, the site was untouched, but her journal was gone. In its place, scratched into the dirt, were 9 small lines arranged in 3 groups of 3. She packed her equipment and left that morning. Months later, she submitted her official report to the university. It was thorough, precise, and entirely clinical. No mention of the sounds, no mention of the figure. But in her private notes, written years afterward, she confessed that she believed Sarah's silence had never ended, that it had simply changed form. It had become the land itself, remembering, whispering its truth to anyone who dared to listen. Emma retired early from fieldwork. She began teaching courses on ethical excavation, often telling her students, sometimes history doesn't want to be disturbed. Sometimes the ground speaks louder than any record. Greenbryer was left to the forest again. The state eventually purchased the land for preservation. They put up a single wooden sign, Greenbryer Site, 19th century plantation remains. Entry by permit only, But people still come, paranormal groups, thrill seekers, historians. Some leave flowers at the clearing, others bring recorders. A few claim they've captured the same whispering voice Emma's team heard, counting slowly, endlessly. And every now and then, when fog drifts low across the field, visitors say they see her. A tall woman standing where the cabin once stood, watching silently, not vengeful, not cruel, just waiting. They say if you speak her name aloud, she turns her head just slightly, as though acknowledging that you too have heard. And if you linger too long, the wind begins to hum, faint and rhythmic, carrying that same impossible sound. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then silence. A silence that doesn't end, but listen. Because some stories aren't meant to be told once, they're meant to be remembered by the world itself. And Sarah, the woman who never spoke, found her voice at last, not through words, but through every heartbeat, every trembling leaf, every whisper that moves through Greenbryer when the night turns still. There is a photograph, faded, sepia-toned, the kind you find in old courthouse archives filed under miscellaneous. It shows a group of men standing before a low ridge of earth, their expressions solemn, their clothing dated to around. The handwritten caption beneath reads, "Excavation near the old Greenbryer place, strange bones." No record exists of what was done with those bones, or who took them, but the photo resurfaced in 2017, when a local journalist named Caleb Monroe began investigating a series of odd disturbances in Powhatan County. He wasn't he ran a small podcast about Southern folklore, recording stories from graveyard caretakers, retired deputies, and descendants of enslaved families who had remained in the region. When listeners began writing in about a silent woman who haunted the James River during late summer, he followed the trail out of curiosity, not expecting to find anything real. He did. The earliest modern mention came from a maintenance report dated 1994. The same year a small historical marker was installed near the Greenbryer site. The report noted repeated vandalism, flowers left at the sign, stones arranged in circles, small crosses tied from reeds. The state assumed teenagers were responsible, but a handwritten addendum by the groundskeeper included a single line, "The piles keep coming back, always 9. Caleb included this detail in his first episode, which he titled, "The Sandbar at Greenbryer." It quickly gained attention. Listeners sent him photographs of the same kind of stone arrangements found miles apart along the James River. Some were recent, but others, judging by the moss and weathering, had been there for years. He traced one cluster to a private farm, whose owner refused him entry, saying, "We don't go down near the water after dusk, things move down there." What began as a folklore episode grew into an investigation. Caleb filed a Freedom of Information request for the original excavation records from Emma Caldwell's university team. What he received was incomplete, only fragments of correspondence, progress reports and one partial field map. But inside the packet was something else, a photocopy of a journal entry, unsigned and undated. The handwriting matched Caldwell's. The note read, "The silence is not absence. It listens. It remembers. It repeats." Caleb read that line on his recording one rainy afternoon in his small studio. His voice caught slightly on the word remembers. Within a week the episode had over 1 million plays. Viewers begged him to return to the site and record more. He did. In late August he drove out to the Greenbryer clearing. He described the air as heavy, almost electrical. The forest pressed close, the trees white and smooth as bone. His first night there, he recorded nothing but cicadas and wind. The second night, just after 3, his microphone captured a rhythmic pattern of clicks, 9 in total, then silence. He uploaded the raw audio, unedited. Listeners began slowing it down, filtering the frequencies. Underneath, faint but certain, was a woman's. The following morning, Caleb left a message on a friend's voicemail. "It's real, not a ghost, something older. The ground itself, you can hear it thinking." That was the last message he sent. 2 days later, his car was found on the access road to the site, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. Inside were his notebooks, his recording equipment, and a single slip of paper placed neatly on the passenger seat. On it were 9 vertical lines drawn in chalk. Authorities conducted a search but found nothing. The official report listed his disappearance as inconclusive, likely accidental, but those who listened to his final upload noticed something else. Near the end of the recording, beneath the sound of rain and wind, a second voice, quieter, slower, seemed to whisper his name. After that, the Greenbryer site was sealed by the county. Trespassing laws were enforced. The marker yet hikers still find traces, fresh stones by the water,
Reed crosses tied with twine, soft prints in the mud that lead nowhere. One visitor, a teacher from Richmond, claimed she brought a class to the river for a field trip, and she told local papers that as the children played near the shore, she saw a tall woman watching from across the sandbar, motionless, her dress rippling, though there was no wind. When she blinked, the figure was gone. That same evening, one of her students showed her a photograph taken on a phone. The woman's reflection was visible in the water, clearer than in life, her eyes fixed directly on the camera. Experts dismissed it as light distortion. Still, the photo spread online, fueling renewed fascination with the legend. Some insisted it was set, others said it was an echo, something left behind when the land could no longer hold its silence. A year later, a group of amateur historians attempted to trace the lineage of Sarah's daughters using genetic databases. They found nothing certain, but one record stood out, a Michigan family line dating back to 1852, all women, all notably tall. The oldest living member, an 83-year-old woman named Ruth Danielson, declined interviews but sent a handwritten letter to a researcher. It read, "I know what you are trying to find. We do not speak of her, but every generation, one of us dreams of the river. The counting never stops. When I was a girl, I thought it was thunder. Now I know it's her. She isn't haunting, she's calling." The letter was Historians debated its authenticity, but the phrasing echoed something found in Yancey's journals, a sentence long dismissed as metaphor. When she stopped speaking, the air began to count for her. The old locals say the air still does. During humid nights when the river fog rolls in thick as breath, they claim to hear soft taps against their windows, 9 in a row, then quiet. No one keeps count aloud anymore. At the county archive, one final document rests unindexed in a manila folder, labeled Greenbryer. It is a transcript from an interview conducted in 1983 with a man identified only as JP. He had been a caretaker for the property in his youth. In the transcript, the interviewer asks if he ever experienced anything unusual. The man answers slowly, his words phonetically recorded. "I saw her once, big as 2 men, standing by the river, didn't move, didn't blink, just looked right at me. Thought I'd lose my mind. Then she spoke, soft as you please, said, 'Tell them I'm still counting.' I ran and I never went back." When the interviewer asked what he thought she meant, JP replied, "It wasn't a warning, it was a promise." That line became the closing sentence of Caleb Monroe's final recovered script. The Greenbryer legend has since become a cautionary story among local historians. They say it is not simply about cruelty or retribution, but about the endurance of silence, how it transforms from something imposed into something chosen. Sarah's silence began as punishment, it ended as power. The ground beneath Greenbryer still each year the James River uncovers new stones and carries old ones away, yet somehow the same patterns return. 9 piles, 9 lines, 9 echoes of a woman who refused to remain voiceless. And if you stand at the riverbank in August, when the air is thick and still, you might hear it, the faint hum of breath moving through the trees, the low murmur of the past exhaling its memory. It sounds almost like counting, almost like someone whispering through the dark water, reminding you that silence is not the same as peace. That memory does not sleep, that she is still there, still listening, still counting.